This is interesting, I think photo consent release form. I thought they were just going to take pictures of us in the audience. So, I thought we were going to be caught on videotape forever.
Not tape, we haven't had videotape.
I think you could construct a whole episode of a US
everything's digital
legal drama around this.
Yeah,
particular
photo consent form. I don't think that does it.
well, you better...
Your Honour.
Yeah,
You better have that out with Fred. I actually sent him consent forms, we didn't use them, he generated his own. So.
Yeah, because he's inviting a lawsuit.
That's the meta drama. He actually wants the lawsuit to show.
In fact, what I'm going to send around another sheet asking people if they'd be willing to be part of a joint class action lawsuit. We can all jointly Yeah, we do like 3 of these before breakfast in the US.
That's right.
Yeah, that's your problem.
Oh, I tell you what, KLM, they're very efficient.
Oh yeah?
There you go. I have it on WhatsApp, email, Messenger, I have boarding passes.
You get like 5 different boarding passes.
Out the wazoo. Excellent. Well, let's see if it actually works. Let me get it.
I'm going to get a train tomorrow, which I'm looking forward to. It's been, I mean, that's one of the things I miss about living in Europe, is just being able to get a train that's sensible.
The train up to Amsterdam?
Actually, I'm going straight from here to Paris.
Oh, that's right, okay.
Yeah. Which is nice, because
The Thalys train, or the high-speed train, or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the Thalys train.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't take long at all.
I mean, sad as I am, I went on Eurostar for the first time.
Oh yeah, I've done that, that's fun.
Just because, when you added up the times, to get to get a flight to Paris, I'd have to go from Leeds Bradford to London to Heathrow, and then from Heathrow to Paris, or Amsterdam to Paris. Adding up all the time, it's a lot easier to get the train down to London, 2 hours, 15 minutes,
Right.
straight across. But I didn't realise that Eurostar treats it as a little bit like an airline, and I thought...
You have to be there half an hour in advance, or?
Well, it turns out they said an hour in advance. I was there like 15 minutes in advance. Plenty of time to go from King's Cross to St Pancras. I was just wandering along, and then the guy said, no, they're closing. Run! Your life depends upon it. Sprinting through.
Yeah,
But the train, I made it, and the train was lovely.
Oh, you have handouts? Yeah, okay, yeah, so I'm all good. Thank you.
But the train's delightful, of course it is, because it's, you can see. Oh, hey, how are you doing? Good to see you. Oh, that's nice, thank you.
Wish I knew it was going to be so cold in Holland. What's that? It's cold today. I feel like it's cold today. Yeah, it was my fault for not checking the weather forecast. I was assuming that it was going to be more like yesterday.
I think it's going to be. I think the cloud will burn off and it will get warmer.
Yeah, maybe you could arrange for some of that in here.
Put on the heating.
You've grown soft, man, living in Miami.
It's true. It's in the 20s, everyone's putting on their sweaters. In the winter time, I mean, in the dead of the winter, and it might drop into the teens.
Yeah.
And you see people wearing down jackets.
Yeah. No, you see that in Brazil. All my students have scarves. I think winter in Brazil is like perfect English summer. Delightful. I'm wearing t-shirts.
It is a perfect English.
They would be wrapped up in
Wearing toques, but the down jacket, really.
Yeah, that's well, I guess maybe they feel, look, I bought this thing. This is my one chance to wear it.
Yourself or not?
Give me something like that. David, do you need a hand up? Is there one roll?
Everybody has a handout? No?
You go.
Okay, welcome back. Our next speaker is Anjan from the University of Miami. And I want to start, I have a short introduction this time. This is Anjan's second and again wonderful book, Scientific Ontology. The final chapter is called Coda, Lessons from Pyrrho and Sextus. And in the beginning of this coda, Anjan recounts the following story. He is invited to speak at a conference of an eminent philosopher, and during that conference he has a dream, and the other participants of the conference, they are sitting in a boat and the water is brilliant and the weather is sunny, and they throw him overboard, and in this dream he can't swim anymore. So he grasps for air and he moves in panic around the water, and then suddenly he knows how to breathe underwater, like Aquaman does. And then he slowly sinks to the bottom, and then finally he reaches the bottom, and there he sits down. Finally I'm grounded. But then he looks around him and it is pitch black. He doesn't see a thing. Okay, so if you want to know how this philosophical cliffhanger ends, you can buy this book.
Thank you very much, Fred. And thank you, of course, for all of the organization of this fantastic conference. This is actually my first time in Rotterdam, and it's been wonderful. It's beautiful. I love it. It's great to be here with an amazing group of people. So I'm really grateful. Thank you. And now for something completely different. Because this is such an expert audience, I think I probably need to start with at least two apologies. The first is that although my talk is about the structure of reality and the reality of structure, it really isn't about fundamental physics, at least not immediately or exclusively. I did actually tell Fred this way back when, that this is what I'd be working on right now, and he said to come anyway. Right? So really this is an apology on behalf of Fred. Fred. The second apology is for the philosophical equivalent of bringing a knife to a gunfight. Right? For most of my life, I felt like I'm always bringing some metaphysics to a discussion in epistemology. Right? A lot of the time, bringing some metaphysics of science to bear on some discussion of scientific realism, which, as you know, many of our colleagues think of as a purely epistemological debate, though perhaps not so much anymore, right? In large part due to the efforts of a lot of people in this room. But today, in passing, I'm going to consider some epistemological issues at what's clearly a conference in the metaphysics of physics, because the primary interlocutors that I want to engage with today are attempting to deal with a traditional metaphysical issue, in part by doing some epistemology. And I think this leads to some confusions. So, what's the issue? Well, a long time ago, I spent some energy thinking about the ancient idea that the world comes to us pre-packaged, as it were, into natural categories of things, the so-called natural kinds. The traditional virtues of these kinds, in addition to being part of nature, are typically described in terms of their being objective and or mind-independent, right? Just the sorts of things that scientific realists are after. Historically, the metaphysics of kinds has run a gamut from strongly constructivist or anti-realist views, that is, thinking of the categories of natural philosophy or science as being largely conventional, and thus not objective or mind-independent. Right? So running a gamut from that to, on the other hand, strongly realist views. But in recent philosophy, there's been what I take to be an interesting and significant shift towards more constructivist sounding and less realist sounding views. Even, and perhaps especially among philosophers of science, which I think is very interesting. There have been some interesting papers, and actually 3 books in the last decade, right? 2 of which came out in Stephen's series with Paul Greg Macmillan, New Directions in Philosophy of Science. So there's definitely a resurgence of interest in natural kinds, and the impetus for the apparent shift in this constructivist direction comes from a recent trend in this literature toward making anthropocentric features of classification, namely the capacity of categories to facilitate specifically human epistemic interests, central to an account of kinds. So I've been wanting to dig into these issues again for over a decade, right? And I'm just starting to do that now. So these are all early thoughts, but 2 apologies is plenty, so I won't apologize for that too. What I'd like to do is just to explore some of these preliminary ideas with you and see what you think. So in a nutshell, here's the gist. I think that taking certain anthropocentric features of scientific categories of things seriously, as the recent literature on kinds is wont to do, is actually a very sensible thing to do for both constructivists and realists, though for different reasons. For constructivists, it makes sense because ultimately they want to deflate the traditional idea of kinds, of natural kinds, into talk about conventional categories of things that are useful to us for various anthropocentric purposes. For realists, it makes sense because ultimately they want to take the success in connection with these anthropocentric purposes, more specifically the satisfaction of our epistemic interests, as a kind of marker or indicator of genuine kindhood. Which is essentially to say that they implicitly take human interest and aims seriously, and they take this epistemic success as evidence for realism about natural kinds. That sort of move from success to realism is, of course, something that we're all very familiar with from debates about scientific realism. So what I want to suggest today is that when we take these interests and aims seriously, is that it's something that makes sense, whatever position you have in the traditional gamut of positions, from hardcore constructivism to hardcore realism. But while taking anthropocentric considerations seriously is compatible with deflationism, deflationary constructivism very generally, I think we have to be a lot more careful when it comes to realism. So I'm going to argue that it's compatible with a form of realism, what I'm going to call hyperrealism, but not so much with traditional realism, which sits somewhere in between deflationism and hyperrealism. So hyperrealism is, I think, a pretty extreme form of realism. What I want to conclude today is that apart from the fact that hyperrealism is so hardcore qua realism, what makes things especially interesting is that if we take the anthropocentric features of scientific taxonomizing seriously, a more traditional realism about natural kinds really isn't tenable after all. And that leaves us with a choice between deflationary, constructivist, anti-realism on one hand, and a pretty extreme form of realism, hyperrealism, on the other. So that's what I want to suggest. Okay, so here's the plan. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about epistemic virtues as markers of genuine kindhood. Then I'm going to introduce some recent examples of thinking about this, first from a deflationary point of view, and then from the point of view of trying to be something like a traditional realist, but in an updated sort of way. And then I'm going to argue that trying to have it both ways, right, being something like a traditional realist, but in a way that takes our anthropocentric aims and purposes seriously, just ends up in a muddle. The antidote to that muddle is hyperrealism. The very idea of hyperrealism raises, I think, some pretty serious questions. So first, epistemic virtues as indicators of genuine kindhood. What was the original motivation for thinking that there are such things as natural kinds in the first place? Well, I take it that the main motivation for thinking that there are naturally occurring categories in nature is something like what we would describe today in terms of a miracle argument, or perhaps a transcendental argument. The idea is that it seems fairly evident that we're impressively successful in making all sorts of inferences that produce knowledge of the world, right? Namely, inductive inferences, predictions, retrodictions, generalizations, and so on. If nature does, in fact, have joints, to use the Platonic metaphor, that we're able to carve along in between, like an epistemic samurai or sushi master, then we'll be working with groups of things that are capable of supporting successful inductive inference. And this thought was present, of course, not just in ancient Greece, but has been with us ever since. So Ian Hacking, for instance, in one of his Hopos-type moments, documented the more recent tradition of positing a conceptual connection between kinds and induction, right? So he followed this trajectory through a whole bunch of thinkers, Mill, Venn, Broad, right up to Quine, and jumping right up to the immediate antecedents of current discussions, right? There's a handout with mostly a bunch of quotations that I'll mention as I go through. So this one by Hilary Kornblith, right? He said that the causal structure of the world as exhibited in natural kinds provides the natural ground for inductive inference. And Richard Boyd said, it is a truism that the philosophical theory of natural kinds is about how classificatory schemes come to contribute to the epistemic reliability of inductive inference, of inductive and explanatory practices. We're coming right up to the present now, in one of the recent books that I mentioned just a moment ago, Scientific Inquiry in Natural Kinds, it's by P.D. Magnus. He actually starts off by giving a pretty comprehensive list of 11 different things that people have historically associated with the concept of natural kind. And then after he considers all of them, the only one that he finds to be generally and plausibly applicable is what he calls the induction assumption. The idea that natural kinds support induction. Now, as an aside, he actually accepts another couple of assumptions, but those are, I think, specific to his own view as opposed to being generally sanctioned as such. Now, I say generally sanctioned. There's at least some resistance to the idea, to this idea, the connection between kinds and induction, based on thinking about our modern conception of what was, in ancient times, the paradigm exemplar of natural kinds. That's biological species. So, for example, in a recent paper by Mark Erashevsky and Thomas Radin, they say, look, the idea that natural kinds are groups of things that support inductive inferences is based on the idea that the members of any given kind share a bunch of properties. That's why predictions and generalizations about them are successful, right? Because you can count on them to have the same properties. But as it happens, they say, two of the most prominent approaches to classifying species in contemporary biology, that's cladeism and evolutionary taxonomy, they recognize species as historical lineages of organisms, descended from a common ancestor. And over a long enough period of time, as you can imagine, in a historical lineage, the properties of organisms at different time slices along this lineage can differ pretty significantly. And to make matters even worse, on these scientifically important approaches to taxonomy, sometimes when a population of organisms branches from its parent population, say a group of them becomes separated, right? Maybe it's a weather event, maybe a volcano explodes or something like that, and a group of them end up being isolated. When that sort of thing happens, the organisms in the parent species and the new species share a lot of properties, and that might actually continue for a long time, even though they're now classified as different species. So from this, Erashevsky and Radin conclude that not all scientific classification is intended to support inference and explanation, as opposed to different aims, right? And here's a quotation: "To limit natural kinds to those kinds that feature in successful inferential practices is an a priori approach to natural kinds that does not do justice to the epistemic practices of scientists." Well, I think that's not quite right. Tellingly, apart from some passing hints about what these different aims might be in terms of the idea of tracking evolutionarily significant groups, they don't really tell us what the different aims are. I think there's a good reason to be skeptical that the aims of cladists or evolutionary taxonomists aren't in fact inductive. So granted, the point of phylogenetic strategies, of biological classification, so those are the ones that define species in terms of historical lineages in some way. The point of them is to identify groups of organisms that are evolutionarily significant. That is, organisms that are subject as a group to some specific cohesive processes described in terms of evolutionary parameters like selection and adaptation and drift. These are precisely the categories that, as groups, are subject to inductive inferences, like those involved in retrodictions, or evolutionary explanations, or predictions in population genetics. So to say that induction is unrelated, or not chiefly related to phylogenetic categories, is, I think, just to be operating with an implausibly narrow view of the nature of induction. I think the whole point of having these cohesive groups is so that you can perform a whole bunch of interesting inductive inferences on them. What about Erashevsky and Radin's worry that thinking about natural kinds as categories that feature in successful inductive practices is a priori? Well, of course it is, right, in a sense. I mean, what else could an account of natural kinds be? Right? I described the very idea that there are natural kinds earlier as the upshot of a sort of miracle argument or transcendental argument. They're posited to make sense of inductive success. So thinking about them is part of the metaphysics of science, where the things we theorize about aren't in any very strict way or any very strict sense a posteriori. But so what? I mean, I'm not sure I understand the complaint. Okay, so having introduced and defended this idea that there are epistemic markers of kinds of things, I want to extrapolate 3 points from this that I think will be important to the conclusion that eventually I want to reach. So, the first point, I hope it's clear by now in what sense I'm talking about the structure of reality. The sense in which I'm talking about the reality of structure hopefully will become clear later on. But I hope at least the first part is clear now. The structure of reality, for my purposes here, is the natural kind structure of the world. In other words, what categories of things are there, and how do they fit together in some sort of complex web? And it's probably important to note at this conference in particular that whatever we say about this aspect of the structure of the world is likely compatible with a range of positions regarding the sense of structure that most people here have come to talk about, namely the structural nature of members of natural kinds. So you might think that the things that are collected together in natural kinds, right, perhaps they're individuals, perhaps they're not, perhaps their natures are structural, perhaps they're something else. These are two, I think, different and likely independent aspects of the structure of the world. Here's the second point that I want to mention before moving on. Same natural kinds are categories that play roles in inductive inference, or that underwrite our inductive success, is not yet to say anything about what natural kinds are exactly, right, metaphysically speaking. There are different possibilities, as we're going to see next when we consider deflationism, realism and hyperrealism. Directly related to this is the third and final point that I want to mention, which is the idea that what counts as good explanation, what counts as a good conclusion to a miracle argument or a transcendental argument can, of course, be read in different ways, right? As demanding a stronger or weaker explanante regarding the relevant explanandum. In this case, inductive success. So with those 3 points in mind, let's turn now to the weakest family of views about natural kinds, and that's deflationism. All right, so up until now, I've been conflating some terms that are often conflated, right? Anti-realism, constructivism, deflationism. I'm going to stick with deflationism because I think that it's the most precise term for what I have in mind today. While I do believe that deflationists about something are typically anti-realists in relation to the way that something has been characterized traditionally, in a realist way, just like deflationists about truth are anti-realists about truth conceived of as a property of things like propositions or beliefs. I suspect that not all deflationists about natural kinds would call themselves anti-realists, though I think they are. And while there's an element of constructivism in any deflationary account of natural kinds, because deflationists typically regard classifications as being constructed in anthropocentric ways, in the philosophy of science, constructivism is often shorthand for social constructivism, which involves a very specific sort of deflation of traditional realism. And not all of these people that I have in mind are that sort of constructivists. So, deflationism is probably a better term for what I have in mind. I take it that a deflationist regarding a concept holds that a common or traditional realist understanding of it is mistaken or misleading, and that it should be replaced by a better understanding of it that recasts the realist understanding in terms of something else, something that's less committal and thus less metaphysically weighty. So, for example, Kuhnian historicists recast traditional realist ontology into sets of historically contingent relations between ideas. Or social constructivists recast realist talk into social statuses and relations. Some logical empiricists and pragmatists recast it into choices of linguistic frameworks that have some pragmatic utility for science or otherwise. What all of these deflationary approaches have in common, I think, is a sort of neo-Kantian kernel. There's a world out there, it's independent of us, but it's a bit too ambitious to think that we can describe it as it is, in its noumenal glory. Nevertheless, we can surely describe it, and even successfully, so far as induction is concerned, in various anthropocentric ways. What we can't or shouldn't try to do is to say anything about what it is, nominally speaking, in virtue of which our inductive practices are successful. They're correlated in some way with the world, such that our categories work for scientific or other purposes, but that's all we can say. What they're tracking exactly isn't something that we can shed light on, or not much light on. So Philip Kitcher's later work on kinds, I think, drifts in this general direction, right, as he becomes more thoroughly pragmatist and less realist by the day. But I think perhaps the best example of this in recent work is Laura Franklin Hall's account of natural kinds, is what she calls categorical bottlenecks. So she's completely transparent that her aim is to develop an anti-realist view of kinds, which is, I think, deflationary in my sense. Right? The idea is that all there is to being a natural kind is being a category that serves our epistemic aims, as well as those of what she calls neighboring agents. The neighbors are conceived as possible inquirers whose aims are within some sort of threshold of closeness to our own. The idea of triangulating on kinds that serve a range of sufficiently closely related epistemic aims is intended, I think, to lend the view a more objective feel than it would have otherwise. And it's probably fair to say that it's more suggestive and worked out in detail, exactly. But none of that matters here, right? What matters here is the idea that serving some epistemic aims, which I characterized in terms of facilitating inductive inferences, is constitutive of what it is to be a kind. There's nothing said here about how precisely these categories line up with what's in the world so as to facilitate success. So as I mentioned earlier, this is becoming trendy, I think, in the philosophy of science. So Mark Wilson, philosopher of biology, says that successful science indicates that there's some sort of correspondence between language and the world. But this doesn't entail that we know anything about the nature of the correspondence. He thinks it may be possible, maybe, to work it out eventually, but we can have knowledge of kinds regardless. Chris Pincock describes this as a patient and limited form of scientific realism. The idea is that we're genuinely engaging with an objective reality, but without any commitment to the idea that we're describing it correctly. Is this really a form of realism? Well, as I hinted before, I think it's a bit of a stretch. It's dubious, perhaps, because our most famous contemporary exemplars of anti-realism don't disagree. So, for example, if you're a constructive empiricist, you deflate the truth of theories until we're left with empirical adequacy. The world is just such that our best theories are empirically adequate. But this is exactly why some of us were incredulous when John Worrell answered our pestering. What do you mean by structure, John? John, what do you mean by structure? Structure, John, structure, what is it? Right. All that pestering, he answered it by appealing to Ramsey sentences. So some of the people in this room will actually remember this. I can barely believe it, but it was almost 20 years ago. It was perhaps the first workshop dedicated just to contemporary structural realism. It was at the LSE, right? So this will be the last one. That was the first one. I was excited. I just finished my PhD, right? So there's this workshop there. Stephen was there. Simon was there. James was there. And we all heard John's talk about spelling out finally what he meant by structure in terms of Ramsey sentence structure. And we were incredulous. And we all said, John, this sounds like some sort of instrumentalism. He said, no, it's realism. We said, no, it's instrumentalism.
Logical empiricism.
Yeah. So, the upshot, for those of you who weren't at the conference, the upshot, some of you weren't alive, I think, when that The upshot of John's clarification of his view of structural realism is that he thinks that scientific realists should believe only the Ramsey sentence structure of our best theories. Once we've replaced the terms ostensibly corresponding to the things in which realists commonly believe, like proteins and positrons, once we've replaced those terms with existentially quantified predicate variables, the variables refer in a highly indeterminate way. In other words, we aren't saying anything determinate about what it is in the world to which they refer. The world is just such that the Ramsey sentence is empirically adequate. I personally think that it might be something of an abuse of our contemporary understanding of scientific realism to call that a version of scientific realism. But sadly, I'm pretty certain that I don't own the copyright over the term, so, so do what you like. The key point that I want to make here is simply that whatever we call that sort of view, when it comes to natural kinds, it's deflationary with respect to what we would credibly recognize as a traditional realist account of kinds. That's because the tradition of kinds, or realism, assumes that they're determinate kinds in nature. Sorry about that. Knowledge of which is evidenced by our inductive success. Now, all of that said, deflationism is, I think, one way of talking about the idea that inductive success is a marker of natural kinds, seriously. It's a marker on this view, albeit via connections to or correlations with objective reality that are sometimes sufficiently opaque that they hide from us what the truth makers are exactly of our successful predictions and generalizations and explanations. Some of you may like that sort of view, some of you may not. It isn't my intention here to argue that you should or you shouldn't, any more than I intend to weigh in on whether constructive empiricists or scientific realists' explanations of why theories are empirically adequate is better, right? Or whether Worrell structural realism is really a form of scientific realism. all I want to do here is point out that deflationism is compatible with taking certain epistemic virtues as markers of natural kinds. It's simply the case that on this view, being an indicator doesn't necessarily tell you much, if anything, about the nature of the indication. Okay, so let's move on to realism. What I'm calling the realist tradition of theorizing about natural kinds is an example of the face value practice of metaphysics and ontology more generally. It's an attempt to describe what the world is like, maybe among other things. In other words, to provide literal descriptions of an external reality. Hence the connotations of objectivity and mind independence. Of course, historically, there have been other connotations, right? And most of them have been gradually left aside as it's become clear that they aren't actually plausible or necessary conditions for kindhood, especially in light of developments in scientific inquiry. So for example, the ancient idea that members of kinds share an essence, right? A set of properties that's necessary and jointly sufficient for membership. I think that's largely been thrown away in light of the fact that a lot of scientific categories just have looser membership criteria. There are still some essentialists around, right? But most philosophers who take scientific theorizing and practice seriously have dumped essences, right, as a necessary condition into the bin. That's an interesting topic all by itself, but I won't go into it here. What I want to note here is simply that, like various other outmoded connotations of kindhood, they've now, in the fullness of time, been mostly left aside. Even while the most important or central connotations for realists, objectivity, mind independence, even while those ones have been retained. A rejection of one of the outmoded connotations in particular is directly responsible for the muddle that I mentioned earlier, that I think has permeated some recent attempts to give a realist-friendly account of natural kinds. So ultimately, this is what I think should push us towards hyperrealism. So let me say something about this connotation in particular. The idea is that the natural kind structure of the world is a unique, hierarchically organized structure, such that nothing belongs to more than one kind unless the different kinds to which it belongs stand in relations of strict subsumption to one another. So, for example, here's how Stathisilas describes the metaphysical dimension of scientific realism in his famous book. And so this, I think, is on your handout. That the world has a definite and mind-independent natural kind structure is a basic philosophical presupposition of scientific realism. It is meant to make scientific realism distinct from all of those anti-realist accounts of science which reduce the content of the world to whatever gets licensed by a set of epistemic practices and conditions. So the idea here is that there's a structure, right? Note the definite article. This is what I think indicates a unique structure, although other people are more explicit about this than Silas. And it isn't reducible to epistemic considerations. What I want to suggest now is that as we become more realistic about how scientific taxonomies actually work in practice, realists have understandably placed more and more emphasis on epistemic considerations. But in the process, they've said ambiguous things that run the risk of making epistemic considerations constitutive of what it is to be a natural kind. That is, they've lapsed in the direction of doing exactly what realists are not supposed to do, right? Suggesting a collapse into deflationism. So, first of all, what do I mean by getting more realistic about how scientific taxonomies actually work? Well, you're actually all familiar with this, even if you didn't know that you were familiar with it. It's actually something that makes up at least one part, a significant part of the recent fascination with the idea of scientific pluralism, though it was already discussed, I think, before that label became popular. Perhaps the most widely discussed illustration of this idea is the notion of biological species. Okay? So at a certain point, it became clear that across the breadth of biology, biologists weren't classifying organisms into species in the same way. And then there were big debates about what the correct way of doing it should be. Is it the biological species concept, according to which species are reproductively isolated populations? Is it some version of the phylogenetic species concept that I mentioned earlier? Right? something like Cladeism or evolutionary taxonomy? Is it the ecological species concept, which divides groups according to their ecological roles in the environment? There are some 20-something concepts of species, right, that are currently in play in biology. So I'm going to make a long story short here. After all of the debates about who is right, I think the consensus today is that it just depends on what you're trying to do. So, are you trying to explain the dynamics of an ecological system? Well, I have a species concept for you that will help with that. Are you trying to explain adaptation within a population? Well, I have a concept for you. What are your aims exactly? Talk of aims here is shorthand for what I began with today in talking about the rationale for thinking that there are natural categories in the first place. What kinds of inductive projections, predictions, retrodictions, generalizations, explanations are you trying to figure out? Different categories of things are better suited to tracking and tackling questions whose answers are given by different kinds of inductive projections. And once you accept that, then it becomes clear immediately that the naive realist view that there's a unique taxonomy, all of whose categories fit neatly into substantive relationships, is just untenable. Instead, what we have are a whole bunch of cross-cutting categories, even in the same domain of science. I think Muhammad Ali Khalidi was the first person to really push this idea in connection with natural kind, but examples abound in the more recent literature, right, including the pluralism literature. So, for example, some of you may have come across Helen Longino's book, in which she talks about 6 different approaches to studying human aggression and sexuality. She says, each of these ways, in this nice phrase, she says they parse the causal space differently, with different interests in mind. Or Stephanie Ruffey has a nice paper from almost 10 years ago on stellar kinds, right, how stars are classified. And it becomes abundantly clear that there are actually a huge number of ways that you could carve up categories of stars depending on what it is exactly that you're trying to predict or explain. So in all of this, aims and interests take center stage, which is all right and good, except for the fact that realists seem to have made a muddle out of it. In some cases, there are attempts to take human epistemic interests seriously that just sound a bit ambiguous to my ears. I'm not sure what it is that's being claimed. So consider Magnus's view, which I mentioned earlier, right? So he starts by saying, different inquiries require cutting along different joints. Okay, so far so good. But then he says, quote, it is a constraint on our account of natural kinds that they form components of successful scientific taxonomy, end quote. But why should it be a constraint on kindhood that they figure in scientific taxonomy? That's to put the cart before the horse, right? The sciences discover certain categories because they're natural. The categories aren't natural because they figure in scientific taxonomy. At least that's what you would say if you were a realist. Later, he reaffirms, right, that his quotation, natural kinds are natural only relative to a specified domain of inquiry. But then, he goes on to say that these domains of inquiry don't depend on the structure of a practicing scientific discipline. So, there's something squishy here, right? Kinds don't depend on scientific inquiry, but scientific inquiry amounts to a constraint on what kinds are. That's what I mean by ambiguity. In other cases, though, I think we get straight out lapsing. You don't believe me? Right. Well, let's check in with card-carrying, original scientific realist, Richard Boyd. From today's perspective, Richard Boyd is like the OG of scientific realism, or at least one of them. So, are natural kinds objective features of the world? Well, here's a quotation from a later paper. Boyd says, natural kinds are features not of the world outside our practice, but of the ways in which that practice engages with the rest of the world. What the? So natural kinds are joint features of the world and our practice. Right? That sounds like a slogan for deflationism. So let me sum up the options so far. The realist tradition has it that there are some categories that are special. They're objective, they're mind independent. To the extent that they're also useful to humans, given our epistemic interests, that's nice, but it's not definitive or constitutive of what it is to be a natural kind. Conversely, deflationism about kinds takes these aims and interests as constitutive and downplays whatever might be going on objectively behind the scenes. It turns out that the myriad collection of human interests that play lots of roles in science have pointed to huge numbers of alternative and cross-cutting categories of things in the world. And naturally, realists have wanted to take that seriously. But in doing so, right, from the perspective of realism, the trend in recent work has been to overemphasize the metaphysical significance of aims and interests. And the result, I think, is ambiguity, or perhaps in some cases just folding up shop entirely and basically collapsing into deflationism. So what's the alternative for realism? Well, haha, you know the answer to that question already because I told it to you at the start. The answer is hyperrealism. So let me say a few things about that in closing. So here's how I put it in my first book, although I didn't actually use the word. And I'm quoting self-indulgently. There are innumerable patterns of spatio-temporal property distribution that exist objectively in nature. In the course of investigating parts of the world, the sciences recognize some of these patterns and describe them in terms of categories. But just saying that, I think, seriously underspecifies just how permissive we might take hyperrealism to be, exactly. And I didn't say anything more about it there. The positive project that I really want to dig in now is to spell this out. And I think it's not especially obvious how to do that. Now, you might think, how hard can it be? I mean, as a first pass, why not simply think of hyperrealism as the view that all objective and mind-independent groupings of things in the world that meet the minimal constraint of being capable of serving inductive projections are natural kinds? Well, the difficulty, or I think what's interesting here, right, is that there are competing intuitions about what groupings actually qualify as objective or mind-independent. So let me put this in the form of a sort of general challenge or heuristic. In order to determine whether a category is natural, we have to do something like evaluate it from a nature's eye point of view. But it's hard to know whether that's something that we can do. So let me give you an example of this just so you can see what I have in mind. So over the past few decades, the question of how permissive we should be or might be in recognizing candidate categories as natural kinds has often been expressed in terms of the slightly unfortunate terminology introduced by John Dupre, right, when he called his view of natural kinds promiscuous realism. So Dupre was reacting to the idea that the only categories that should count as natural are scientific categories. His basic idea, which, for what it's worth, I agree with, was that while it's true that scientific categories are often tracking natural kinds, there's no obvious reason why the sciences alone are capable of identifying natural kinds of things. So if the folk category of fish includes whales, and this category is so configured, supports all sorts of inductive projections that are relevant to, say, the folk, right, say the fisher folk, then it's a natural kind. Even if scientists classify whales, which are mammals, in a separate category from fish, which are not mammals, they're fish. The folk and scientific categories are examples of cross-cutting kinds. As an aside, perhaps this is less intuitive an example for us in modern times, right? Because I'm pretty sure that even the folk concept of fish now excludes whales for most people. Because this particular aspect of scientific taxonomy has been largely absorbed by the folk, right? in presumably most parts of the world. But imagine a time before that was the case. As I mentioned, I share Dupre's intuition here, but the widespread consensus among philosophers was, and perhaps still is, for all I know, that he'd gone slightly off the deep end. They were lining up around the block to argue that promiscuous realism is untenable. But here's where I want to invoke my challenge, right? Is the judgment that it's wrong to be so permissive as to recognize folk categories as tenable natural kinds defensible from a nature's eye point of view. It's really hard, I think, to make a compelling case. So consider Khalidi's case, right? He says that while placing whales in the category of fish may serve inductive purposes. Here's his claim. He says, not all purposes are created equal. But what could that mean, right, from a nature's eye point of view? From that point of view, it's hard to see how the purposes of anyone in particular, including evolutionary systemicists, are superior, say, to the purposes of fisherfolk or tourists on the Florida Keys. Or consider Erashevsky and Radin's thought that Dupré he's simply wrong that both the terms fish and mammalia pick out natural kinds because folk biology and scientific biology are competing taxonomic programs. And the latter one, the scientific one, is better because the category, this is a quote from them, the category fish is not part of any current progressive classificatory program. But that seems to me to miss the point, right? I mean, first of all, to the extent that the folk category and the scientific category are adopted to serve different aims and thus fuel different sorts of inductive projections, it's just a mistake to say that they're competing classificatory programs. And the issue of whether a scientific research program is progressive or degenerating, right, to use Lakatos's terminology, is a point about the methodology of scientific research programs. It doesn't tell us anything all by itself about what's natural. So here, I agree with David Ludwig, right, who I think has perhaps taken this mantle, the Duprean mantle, upon himself. He's really doing really interesting work on ethnobiology, right, which is the study of how organisms are understood by different cultures, which often, as you might expect, ends up incorporating some pretty sophisticated biological knowledge. So here's a nice example of his that I think is analogous to Dupre's whales and fish, and I've given it to you in its fullness on your handout, just because I think it's so nice, so I'll just read it to you. So Ludwig asks us to consider a common indigenous taxonomy in which bats are categorized together with birds. You might argue, he says, and here's the quotation, that such a taxon only reflects one superficial property, the ability to fly, instead of real biological discontinuities that characterize genuine natural kinds. However, this ignores the wide range of properties that are typically shared by bats and birds. For example, both typically have wings, a light bone structure, a keeled sternum, that was new for me, I didn't know that, a similar size range, streamlined bodies, high metabolism, migratory behavior, similar natural enemies, a fruit and insect-based diet, also including the vampire bats here, or vampires. They both typically fly, disperse seeds in the environment, reduce local insect biomass, and so on. Okay, the point is obvious by now, right? There's a wealth of inductive projection that's supported by all of these commonalities that have nothing to do with the lack of common ancestry in the phylogenetic history of bats and birds, which is clearly interesting and important in biological taxonomy. And it's really difficult to see why the latter should uniquely determine what counts as natural. But all of this said, many people still hold the intuition that promiscuity needs to be bridled in some way. So Matthew Slater says that immoderate pluralistic realism just isn't plausible. Right? So he cites Kitcher, who says that, look, pluralistic realism is just too cheap, right? Because it follows merely from a modest realism about sets. You can make a set out of any old collection of things. And even Dupré, right, Mr. Promiscuity himself, balks at unbridled promiscuity and kind of waves his hand towards additional constraints, right, like significance. He says, well, some categories are going to be significant and others aren't. But again, significance is an anthropocentric notion. I'm not sure what an interest-neutral characterization of it would be. So it isn't clear to me how it can serve as a constraint on objective or mind-independent kinds. He also points or waves his hands a bit in the direction of informativeness. Is there an interest-neutral reading of that? Well, maybe, right? Perhaps there is. So anyone who's read chapter 4 of Ladyman and Ross, which may well be everyone here, will recall that they appeal there to information theory and Daniel Dennett's idea of real patterns. Well, I won't go into details here, but the basic idea is that while generically a pattern is any relation among the data, a real pattern is one that facilitates inductive success. That sounds good to me. But now let's train this on the problematic that I have here in thinking about trying to demarcate what's natural. If what we're ruling out by this is simply putative kinds that don't facilitate inductive success, then this probably doesn't amount to a constraint on hyperrealism per se. Of course, they say more than this, right? So like Dennett, James and Ross think that there are real patterns that satisfy compressibility requirements. So here's the quotation: a real pattern must admit of capture using a smaller number of bits of information than the bitmap transcription of the data from which the pattern could be computed. But they also go beyond Dennett and say that maxing out on compressibility or compactness will identify the real kinds and protect against the worry that different agents might try to identify different kinds based on different levels of compactness. That may fit their idiosyncratic preferences, right, based on their idiosyncratic purposes. And here's a question. Does nature really care about compactness? I don't know. I think there are a lot of open questions surrounding what things look like from a nature's eye point of view, the answers to which should, ideally, help us to grapple with the very idea of mind independence. So these are the questions that I want to dig into. What I hope I conveyed today, at least, is just the idea that the notion of natural kinds has benefited hugely from developments in science, which over time has incorporated a much more variegated set of aims, purposes, and associated categories that are apt for achieving those aims and purposes than a lot of prior a priori theorizing about natural kinds might have suggested otherwise. If you take those things seriously, traditional realism doesn't seem to be on the cards, which leaves us, I think, with a starker and intriguing choice between deflationism and hyperrealism. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, Anjan. I'll give you a minute again to formulate your questions, and in the meantime, I want to tell people who are new here today that you are being recorded and we need your written consent. Yeah. So go to the registration desk, which is temporarily vacated. Okay, that's it. Well, hands. James, 1, 2, Guido, Simon, Kerry, John. Always the same people. James.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anjan. But I think you're right that there are cross-cutting categorizations that are kind of equally scientifically legitimate. And you're surely right that some classifications are only going to make sense for relative to purposes or perhaps to responses or something. So if you were to think about the classification of sound, right, would be a good example. Sound is a response-dependent thing anyway, but we can still classify about harmony or different kinds of music or whatever. Clearly a response-dependent thing, but also some kind of objectivity to classification. So is there, I mean, I don't know, one question is why you call it hyperrealism, I guess. Like, it just mean, why do you present it as a kind of extreme form of realism? Well, I would have thought it's quite a weak form, but I guess that doesn't matter so much. I suppose more broadly, I'm sort of pressing the question, is the lesson of your talk, which is building on this work by Gray and others, that the category of natural kinds is just too simplistic, and that we need lots of ideas of natural divisions or classifications, and we might need the idea of natural property, but we certainly don't want a single idea of kind, and it's either a kind or not, because there are just so many cross-cutting kinds. Is that the idea?
Yeah, kind of. So let me see if I can spell that out a bit. So I think you're absolutely right to say, look, we could call what I'm calling hyperrealism. We could actually say that it's very weak. It's logically weak in the sense that it's going to allow lots of things to count as times. Right? I called it a strong view of realism because I'm taking it that the foil, right, among realist positions is one according to which there are just a few special categories of things out there, right? And they fit neatly together in this neat subsumptive hierarchy, right? That's the order of nature. It's present in a simple thing that you could probably print on, one page in a beautiful medieval folio, right? These are the natural kinds, right? And it turns out that the categories that we might want to consider real, if you're a realist, if you're that way inclined, are going to be way, way, way more variegated and complicated, and there are going to be many, many more of them, right? So there are going to be huge numbers of them. So in that way, it's kind of an extreme form of realism because we're just a realist. We're being realists about so many categories, right? Now, do you think that's a problem?
I think multi-realism would be more apt.
Sorry?
Realism.
Sorry, multi-realism?
But anyway,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I take
yeah.
the point.
So it's just the idea, I think that, the traditional idea is that, look, the virtue of discovering natural kinds is that, once we get to the bottom, nature is simple and ordered. And it turns out that actually nature is not at all simple, it's usually complex and a big mess. We need to be realists about all kinds of things in order to make sense of scientific practice. So that was the basic idea. So when we say that natural kinds, the idea of it is too simplistic, I think that's right in that particular sense, that the traditional realist idea, or at least the tradition that I was theorizing, that I was suggesting is just a non-starter anymore, it's too simplistic.
Good, that's very good. But
Yeah.
can I just ask that you kind of put it slightly differently and don't say nature's a big mess without adding, because if you just say that, it sounds like pluralism, right? It's all just a big mess, it's all really complicated. I mean, better to say something like nature's structured in many different ways, at many different scales.
That's
Something
exactly right. So in that, I completely agree with you. So what I don't want to say, what I don't want to give the impression of saying, right, when I throw out expressions like nature is a big mess, I certainly don't want to give the impression of what some of the pluralist folk say, like Ken Waters says, when he says, well, there is no structure,
Right.
right?
Good.
It's just a kind of formless morass, and then we can shape it any way we like in the scientific categories. And that's exactly not what I'm saying. In fact, I'm saying the polar opposite, which is that it's full of structure,
Good.
right?
But
It's
not
just
one
chock
simple,
full of structure.
yeah, not the one simple structure of the traditional
Right.
scientific kinds.
Exactly.
Okay, number two.
Thank you.
Tanya?
Yeah, maybe my question has already been answered because of this previous question. But anyway, thanks for your talk. It's always the question whether one doesn't really understand or one disagrees. But if I understand correctly, there can exist at one time multiple taxonomies for nature, of nature. How does this not lead to a form of constructivism, where one in a sense decides at a certain time, oh, I'm going to use this taxonomy and not the other one? How is this not constructivism?
Sure. So, no, it's a good question. So I don't think it's sufficient for constructivism that we make choices about what taxonomies to use. Because it's perfectly compatible, I think, with realism that you might select the right tool for the job, whatever job you have in mind. So if you're interested in trying to understand certain phenomena, right, at a certain scale or in a certain kind of context, right, it might be that there is division of the things that are present, right, in that context into natural kinds that will suit the purposes of answering whatever questions you have about those phenomena, right? The difference between the constructivist and the realist, as I painted, is the constructivist will say that, well, the categories that we are using to investigate these phenomena, right, are merely of our choosing. The realist is saying that we've chosen them, but they're real, right? So if we're doing our job well, right, we're triangulating on existing features of reality. We choose them because they're the right ones to choose to do this job. Right? want to give an explanation of what happens when two particles, collide. Right? We're not going to appeal to a taxonomy of biological species. I mean, that's just a silly way of saying that we need to pick out the kinds that are relevant to our inquiry. And in that sense, we choose, if we're doing our job. But that by itself isn't sufficient for constructivism. I think constructivism involves a further commitment to the idea that, as I described it in the deflationary scenario, right, we have categories that work. There might be other categories that work. To the extent that we have categories that work, there's really nothing more to be said about whether they correspond to real divisions in nature or not. It's that deflating of the realist commitment that these categories are really out there that I have in mind when I'm talking about constructivist deflation.
Okay, number 3 was Guido?
Well, I think you probably already answered my question. Just wanted you to comment a bit more on the picture that you have, between sort of natural kinds on the one, on the sort of more deflatory aspects of the natural kind, and what the sort of realist basis is that justifies these particular choices, and I think it might go in the direction of the sort of real patterns. The analogy I had in mind comes from von Frauen's pragmatics of explanation. He distinguishes between explanations and the causal network, and explanations are pragmatic because they're sort of highlighting of certain bits of the causal network, but there's something that's in fact the job of science to figure out, causal networks, which are objective and make perfect sense of the explanations we give. We've got that objective bit and then the pragmatic bit, and we put them together, and then we get a complete picture about explanation. And I was just wondering whether something like that is a good analogy to what you're thinking about natural kinds.
I don't know. I suspect not. But let me throw an analogy back at you, because as you were speaking, another one occurred to me that I think fits the description that you gave. And this is one particular reading of Locke. So there are different ways of reading what Locke was saying about natural kinds, but one of them is to say that Locke thought that we have knowledge of nominal essences of things. Those are the ideas that we associate with the categories that we use. What we don't have, and what we're in fact incapable of knowing, are the real essences of things. So there's surely pragmatic utility in using the kinds that we have, insofar as they facilitate inductive success, and insofar as they're pragmatically useful, right? It's an epistemically sensible thing to do to rely on them. We can call them kinds. But there's a difference between that and thinking that you have some knowledge of the underlying reality, which he would describe in terms of the real essences of things. And this is the particular reading of Locke, there's no obvious reason to think that the nominal essences that we operate with pragmatically very successfully stand in any one-to-one correspondence with the real essences, right? That we will never know, right? So it's not as though just by having nominal essences we're somehow triangulating on, in a one-to-one correspondence sort of way, the real kinds, right, in the world. So the pragmatic, right, that's what I'm sort of describing there, the pragmatic use of nominal essences by Locke, an example of the sort of deflationary attitude, right? The realist is thinking that, well, actually we were talking about the real kinds, right? Whatever it is that's behind the scenes. And the deflationary pragmatic person is saying, well, whatever's going on behind the scenes is whatever's going on behind the scenes, but I've got these categories that are nominal essences, they work just fine, they're pragmatically useful, that's good enough for me, right? that's the sort of distinction I have in mind. So I don't know whether that maps onto the use of the pragmatic conception of the causal nexus that you had in mind, but that's the example that occurred to me while you were speaking. Does that do justice to the...
It's not exactly what I had in mind, because that's what you just said is sort of the deflationary thing. In the analogy with the pragmatics of explanation, I mean, Van has a definite picture about what it is beneath the talk of explanation that in fact does the work. I mean, we wouldn't have explanations if we didn't have the causal relations. Somehow, Van Prassen, the arch example of constructivist, when talking about these things, seems to be sort of marrying, sort of pragmatic and realist aspects in a way that looks a bit like what you're talking about.
Right. So, I mean, this is the sense in which, I describe the deflationary views as all sharing in common a kind of neo-Kantian kernel, right? But of course, the neo and neo-Kantian, right, hides a variety of sins, right? I mean, there are different ways of, it's not simple if you're neo-Kantian, but there are a lot of different ways, right, of falling under this banner, right? And that's part of what I was trying to get at when I was drawing this analogy to world structural realism, which is to say that, he thinks that the world, right, the stuff, right, to which the existentially quantified predicate variables are attached in some way, shape, or form, right, it's not that he's an anti-realist about the existence of the external world, right, but, any more than a social constructivist generally is an anti-realist about the existence of the external world. I mean, if you read, the more recent and clearer explications of the, Edinburgh School Strong program, they say, look, we're not saying that there isn't a world out there, right? Of course there's a world, right? It's just that our ways of latching onto it, right, are such that we shouldn't think that we can, determinately, definitively refer to mind-independent objective entities. What we're referring to is a kind of joint product of our ways of knowing and that world, which we can't describe in its nakedness, right? So that's the kind of, now, if you want to call that a sort of realism, right? Again, this was my point about how I don't want to legislate for terms. I mean, yeah, sure, it's a kind of realism. Maybe it's a realism about the existence of the external world. Maybe it's a realism about the noumena. Maybe it's a, but this is why I was using the locutions such that to describe some of these people. The world is such that, right, our theories are empirically adequate. Right? The causal nexus of the world is such that, right, our explanatory models are efficacious. Right? But such that isn't a very detailed or clear description. It's just kind of a placeholder for something that, yeah, something out there is real and it's connected in a convenient way so as to make what we want to claim true. But we're not saying anything about the making relation.
Question number 4. Simon?
I think so. Yeah. Okay. So I enjoyed the talk so much, and partly because what you were saying and thinking about it in a way that I hadn't perhaps in such a focused way done, but also because as you were talking, I was just working out how this would go in physics, actually, rather than biology. And there's so many parallels in physics, of course. In the sense, what are the natural kinds of physics? Well, there are solids, there are liquids, there are glasses, or maybe glass turns out to be a liquid. You get problems with correlation. The condensed matter physics. So you've got all of the special sciences within physics, and you can go down. Atomic physics, nuclear physics are special sciences within a certain picture of physics. And one way to talk about all of that is it's all emergence. These special sciences within physics are emergent phenomena. It's very messy. I I like James's way of putting it, a sort of a multi-realism about all of this stuff. But one thing that seems to come to the surface is it's just not seen as a problem somehow in realism vis-a-vis physics. And I was just wondering, why is that? You know, in a sense, it seems to have become a problem in philosophy of biology. It doesn't seem to be a problem in philosophy of physics. In philosophy, I mean, in physics, I mean, one aspect of where is the human, you know, the trail of the human element, we do create artificial systems. You know, we created electronic and digital processing systems, and that becomes a kind of natural kind. It's not a natural kind. We built these things. They didn't really exist in nature at all. Quantum computing, a fortiori, you know, these things didn't exist, but it will become, it's already become, a whole field, a kind, a natural kind within the business of doing quantum physics. But that seems entirely okay somehow. I still, you know, I fail to see a concern that this is some weakened position of realism and so on and so forth. But so here's my question, all this is in common. My question is that maybe what happens in physics is ultimately we do have these extraordinary natural kinds which are the four forces. Strong, weak, electromagnetic, nuclear, you know, so and that turns out we had a cross-classification problem, it's electroweak, QCD, gravity. We do have those natural kinds, and those seem really robust somehow. And this has nothing to do with human imagining, or so a realist would say. And is it because in biology, as you go down, you do eventually get to physics, but in a very unhelpful way. I mean, physics, it may help you with certain aspects of metabolism and biochemical processes and so forth, but in a sense, it's not helpful in biology to sort of reach ground level at the physics natural kinds. And maybe that's not true of chemistry. You know, maybe that's not true of crystallography, not true of meteorology. You know, but maybe it is true of biology, and this is something special and rather distinctive about biology. And perhaps this is making the questions that you've been addressing particularly salient as goes realism in biology. So I just wonder what you think about that. It's a suggestion and it's a question.
Yeah. Well, I think you put your finger on a number of really deep and interesting questions about how we think about this across the sciences, across the disciplines of the sciences. Because I think that there is certainly a view that probably most people share, which is that the kinds of cross-cutting and the extent of hyperrealism that I've been describing becomes more and more intuitively obvious as we ascend, you know, Putnam and Oppenheim's inverted pyramid, right? So I wouldn't even say it's just biology. I mean, when you go beyond biology, you start thinking about, you know, the psychological or the social sciences. I mean, there you get all kinds of examples how we might, right, do this kind of differential parsing. And that, you know, as we go, right, further down the pyramid, we get more and more instances of what you, I think, nicely called what seem like very robust kinds. And so I think that's a real thing. And I think there are probably interesting things to be said about why we have this intuitive idea, which may well be right in terms of the complexity and the relative simplicity. Not that physics is simple and that the social sciences are complicated, that's too anodyne or a simplistic thing to say. But that there's a sense in which at more refined scales, right, we're screening out a lot of the noise that might otherwise make for cross-cutting categories seeming plausible. That said, you know, I think there are lots of interesting questions. So you were, I think, interestingly, rightly, and kind enough to point out that even in physics, in a lot of parts of physics, there are lots of ways in which this might enter. And I think one of the reasons why we might see this as less applicable to some of these domains, you know, towards the tip, is that theorizing about what the natural divisions are doesn't seem to lend itself very easily or very commonly to a lot of alternatives at any given time size. Right? So there were just lots of conceptions of what biological species are. But when we try to apply those morals to things, say, in fundamental physics, how do we think about it? You might think, well, let's imagine a counterfactual history in which we theorized about these things differently. Right? I mean, it's a very abstract sort of consideration. Right? Let's read what Andrew Pickering says about how these categorizations are social institutions and they may have been different. Right? That again is a very kind of abstract theorizing about how things might have been different. In the biological, the social case, we just have examples of things being different. In the physical case, we often just don't have examples of different ways of carving things up. So I think it's harder to grapple with those things. I remember, this just brings to mind, there's a place where Michael Redhead is talking about Heisenberg, wondering about whether we should really think of a proton and a neutron as different kinds of particles, or whether we should think about them as just different states of the same particle. Right. And I remember asking Stephen about this when I was like this big, and Stephen said, yes, but no, but yes, but no. Sorry, Stephen, that's all I remember.
Sounds like it.
So yeah, I think it's just more difficult to imagine what the possibilities might be for classifying things differently the further down we go.
But I do think in physics we do have a multiplicity of different classifications. I really think almost everything that you said does find application in physics, but I was trying to articulate what might be distinctively different in biology. And here's one way of putting it. It could have been that in physics we had the special sciences, and the further down we go, we just had sort of more cross-cutting kinds. It just seemed to go on without end. It could have been like that, and there wouldn't have been this extraordinary simplicity of the standard model. So, and in biology, it's almost as though that development never happened. And maybe there was a time when we thought it would. There would be some level of vitalism, which is something we discovered, and this would be a realm of simplicity and sharply designated natural kinds or something like that. It just didn't happen. And in a sense, what's going on in biology is it maps pretty well onto physics, but without ever bottoming out. And I think this changes. I don't quite know how to say or what to conclude, but it seems to me to change things almost in biology, philosophy, biology, in this respect. Really, really clever answer. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Who was next in line? Carrie.
Yeah. So thanks, Anjan. That's good. So for me, I've always just instinctively, I'm just absolutely fine with this idea that certainly when it comes to kind of higher level ontology, there's just no good answer to the question of whether X ties to Y until you told me why it is that you're interested in making this classification of other categories up, and also for scientific purposes. So it seems I never quite understood in some sense, partly for it to be a realist, you have to think these are ready-made world in the sense of all these a given set of sort of natural kinds. Where a kind is understood as some kind of confederation of properties. So I think I think it's important in thinking about this issue, given that it seems like a lot of people in this room are certainly just perfectly comfortable with this idea that scientific classification is really just a matter of what scientific purposes you're interested in at that time. To turn this into a problem, we need to remember in turn what purposes natural classification is supposed to do in philosophy, right? And so there we think, so I think one of the real kind of lasting for me legacy of Lewis is really kind of hammering home all the work that natural kind classifications do, or these objective distinctions in nature actually does. So you've mentioned moral and morality sentence, so arguably this is just trivially true, and unless you impose that there's some natural kind structure out there in the world. So it's important to remember, before we all get too kind of relaxed about, of course this is all absolutely fine, that actually is going to be potentially enormous kind of knock-on philosophical effects if we aren't, if there isn't some kind of objective privilege carving of in nature. But it seems to me that really all you need for there to be those carvings in nature is to accept not that there's natural kinds, but just that there's natural properties, right? And I don't think that, so I think, to turn this into a really interesting philosophical question, you need to argue that there's no such thing. You can't get away with the concept of natural properties. These are fundamental properties, not confederations, like an electron is a confederation of fundamental properties, spin half, charge, whatever, mass, whatever, and so on. So let me ask you, do you think that, even when we raise this problem, we imagine there's this manifold out there of properties kind of instantiated in space and time. But in saying that, you've already assumed that there are such a thing as these fundamental properties. Do you think that the fundamental properties are themselves amenable to a kind of pragmatic or Dupre type sort of analysis, or do you think that they really are out there in nature?
So thanks a lot. Some really nice issues there. I think they're, maybe I can resolve them into two, and I'll say something about those. So first of all, this is more a comment than an answer to your question. I think you're absolutely right that there is this, perhaps not maybe, but an idea that's shared more broadly as well, that in order to really understand, the world as a realist wants to, right, hopes and desires to, we should be able to divide it up into things that are confederations of properties. And I think one of the morals, one of the things I was trying to suggest, that by paying attention to how the sciences have developed, that notion has become implausible in various ways, is just to think about the kinds of the ways in which our categories often just aren't reflective of confederations of properties. So sometimes we think about kinds in terms of functional properties, where the confederations of things that might exemplify those functional properties might be very different, right? So the confederation isn't what's important, it's the function that's multiply realized that's important. Or, when you think about historical properties, like being descended from a common ancestor, as being what's relevant to thinking about a group, right? Well, that again is not a confederation per se, right? It's a historical property. So I think that there are all kinds of ways in which, again, the sciences have loosened up or should loosen up our understanding of what it means to talk about kinds, and it shouldn't be in this just these confederations of properties. That's more a comment. Now, getting to your question. So, when I originally started thinking about this, way back when, as I said, I'm just sort of coming back to it now, I thought that the best way to think about this was in terms of there being two kinds of kinds. There are kinds of properties, and then there are what people traditionally now call natural kinds, which are things that have or exemplify or are bundles of, right, the property. So I was thinking very much in terms of natural properties being the bedrock of any sensible realism, right? So in my first book, I was arguing for scientific realism. I called the view of scientific realism that I was arguing for semi-realism. I said, semi-realism is a realism about properties in the first instance. And by realism about properties, I don't mean that they're universals necessarily, not that kind of realism about properties, but that what's, the natural divisions are that there are natural properties, right? Perhaps sparse collection of properties, but whatever they are, these are the properties. But then I realized that that all by itself wasn't quite enough, just because of what I sort of added to that picture in the chapter on natural kinds, which was the notion of what I called sociability, which is the idea that it isn't just that we have these properties that might serve as the bedrock for realism. I do think there has to be a bedrock for realism at some point, right? There's going to be something that you're realist about, out of which you might then build other things that you're realist about. But it turns out that there is this, what I call systematic sociability, which is the collections of these properties seem to, euphemistically, like each other's company, right? They do hang out together in space-time. So I think both of those things are actually important in thinking about what we have in mind when we talk about natural divisions, right? It's there are natural properties, but there are also the fact that they like each other's company, right, to varying extents and varying degrees. So there are subatomic particles that really like each other, their properties really like each other, they're always and only found together, but then there are other things where the systems of sociability are much looser. all of that said, I do think that you can give, right, if you're hard pressed or just really keen to do it, a deflationary account of all of that. Right? I mean, just think about Goodman. You can say, yeah, there are all of these properties, right? But what do we mean when we talk about all these properties? Really, what we're talking about are predicates that are entrenched in our language. And that might be a social phenomenon, that might be a sociolinguistic phenomenon, that might be something other than, right, what we would characterize it as being if we were realists. So I do think that, there's perhaps coherent, some might argue incoherent, but there's at least a prima facie way of talking about these things about which I like to be realist, that would count as deflationary, if you were really inclined to do so. But I think if you're going to be a realist, then you have to be a realist about something. And I think natural properties is a good place to start.
Final question, Jonathan.
We're really perfectly timed because my question flows very naturally from the discussion we just had with Carrie. Because I was also thinking of natural properties versus natural kinds, and I'm coming out of a kind of Armstrong-Lewis tradition, where natural properties are like baked in from the start, but kinds aren't really even on the agenda, much less natural ones. I mean, if you're going to recover that, that's going to come much later. And what struck me is that these notions of inductive success and compressing information and the like that people like Magnus and yourself are using to draw us into talking about natural kinds are strongly language-dependent notions. So, first of all, as Lewis pointed out, I mean, if we're just allowing ourselves any language whatsoever, we can compress all of science into a single predicate that just ranges over all and only nominally possible individuals. Right? So this is Lewis's trivialization of the laws. The one and only great theory of everything is FA, where F is the tetra applying to all nominally possible individuals. Why isn't that? Why isn't there like an a priori argument that physics is going to wind up there? It's because, well, F probably isn't a property. So there's a restriction on which properties we use. Likewise, to take another example, I think maybe is from Davidson. Davidson points out that when we get to induction, if we're doing induction on emeralds, it's probably good to use GRU. But if we're doing induction on emerires, these are things that are emeralds. Oh, there's emeroses. But the emeride, those are, right, there's the green red and there's the green blue ones. So we can do emeroses. Those are things that are emeralds if they're unobserved before 2000, or roses otherwise. Emerires are emeralds if unobserved before 2000, or sapphires otherwise. But let me do emerires because then I can do GRU and not GRIT. So if we're doing induction on the color of emerires, they're GRU. I mean, that's a very good way to compress the color information about the color of emerires. So all of this stuff about induction and what our purposes are, and how to compress information, is going to be language dependent in this way. So the way that I was thinking about it, and maybe this is just really fitting what you were saying, Exchange with Carrie was coming out of your first book, it's already embedded in thinking, is that we first need to set a language, and maybe natural properties can help privilege and language. And only then do these notions of inductive success and compressing information have fixed results. And then you cease to get which properties like to hang out with each other. This is like the real realist resource here. If I'm understanding what came out of this exchange, I think this might fit the way you're thinking about it, is really something like Armstrong-Lewis natural properties.
So I want to say yes with an asterisk or an addition, right? So I think I agree with everything you said. But I do want to add that as well as baking in natural properties from the start, I mean, again, if you're inclined towards realism or trying to make sense of a picture of the world from that perspective, I do think that there's something, if it isn't fully baked in, it's, half baked or, some way along the baking process, right? that corresponds to talk of kind. So I don't think of it as coming way down the road, right, in the way that Armstrong or Lewis might. I think of it as being fairly, you know, I feel as though it's been in the tray in the oven for quite some time, precisely because it's an empirical discovery, I think, what degrees of sociability there are in the world, right? So it's not that merely that we discover natural properties, we also discover facts about sociability. And so I think they're there as well. Okay? So that's not something that we construct necessarily. That if you're happy with the idea of natural properties, and then you're happy with the idea that they stick together, right, with varying degrees of strength.
It's a contingent nomological accident that there's any interesting clustering or associability among these natural properties. It's not like the world just like comes with like, you know, one type of thing, another type of thing, another type of thing. That's just, some worlds just happen to wind up with properties. Some worlds have a dynamics such that their natural properties tend to cluster in interesting ways. And cool if we get to a world like that, maybe ours looks like a world like that.
Yeah,
That's not a deep metaphysical.
Well, it might be. I think it depends on how we think about what's contingent. So, right, if you're Armstrong and Lewis, I can imagine, you know, you could freely combine all these natural properties, and they would. If all of these properties could exhibit completely different patterns of sociability in a possible world, right, that might be interesting. If it turned out that because of the way we think about properties, right, you're a dispositional essentialist, maybe you think they couldn't be different in different possible worlds. I actually think that that question might not be relevant to how we think about the scientific account of the actual world, just because whether the connections are, whether the facts about sociability are contingent or necessary, they are what they are, right? And so I think that's all we need to get started when we're thinking about what the natural kinds are. And in any given world, right, those facts about sociability are going to be baked in from the start, whether it's contingent or something else.
Okay, people, let's thank Anjan for his talk. We reconvene at 1400 hours, and options have been explained to you yesterday.
But there are people who are here for the first time, Fred, as you pointed out earlier. So could you explain the lunch options again?
No.
You're a hard man.
Talk to your neighbor.
I know. Sorry about that.
Yeah.